The air on the Vance plantation was always thick with heat and hardship, but on this morning in 1839 it carried something colder, a mystery that clung to the air like mist. Heavy iron chains, the cruel emblems of bondage, hung not from the wrists of a man, but from the branches of the great oak tree. They swayed gently in the wind, a ghostly pendulum counting the seconds since Tobias Green, the blacksmith who had labored beneath them day after day, had vanished without a trace. None on the plantation knew that his disappearance would become a legend whispered for generations. The chains he left behind would turn into a warning, a promise, and a question that no one could ever answer. As the sun rose higher over the Georgia soil that morning, one truth settled like dust on every tongue. Nothing on the Vance plantation would ever be the same again. A week before that fateful morning, the plantation baked under a suffocating sun. The heat pressed the air from a man's lungs and shimmered off the red clay fields like a fever. Beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient oak, Tobias Green worked steadily at his post. The tree was more than wood and leaf. It was a silent witness, its gnarled trunk scarred by decades of suffering, its roots drinking from soil rich with tears and toil. Tobias sat on a low stool, a heavy file in his calloused hand. With slow, rhythmic strokes, he sharpened the dulled edge of a hoe. His hands, broad and powerful, were a map of his life, burned scars from the forge, thick calluses from years gripping hammer and tongs. Yet for all their roughness, they moved with the precision of a craftsman, each motion deliberate, each spark purposeful. He was a quiet man, his expression unreadable, his silence carrying more weight than speech. His deep-set eyes missed nothing, the weary dip of a fellow worker's head, the furtive glance shared in passing, the unspoken language of endurance that connected them all. Others greeted him with small nods or hushed words as they passed toward the fields, each interaction heavy with shared burden. The air under the oak was a blend of scents, hot metal, dry dust, and the faint sweetness of magnolia drifting from the master's house. That distant fragrance, beautiful and cruel, mocked the world Tobias lived in. From the shaded veranda of the big house, Elias Vance watched the scene unfold, a sweating mint julep in hand. He was a man who viewed the world as a ledger, every soul on his land a number in his columns of profit and loss. His overseer, Mr. Croft, stood beside him, a thick-necked brute whose cruelty had become second nature, the price of cottons holding steady. Vance murmured, swirling the ice in his glass, "But the new equipment costs more each season. We'll need every hand working at peak efficiency." Croft grunted, his small eyes fixed on Tobias beneath the oak. "He knows his place, they all do. A little pressure keeps the gears turning. See that he's not overworked before the harvest." Vance replied absently, already drifting back into his thoughts of numbers and quotas. Croft's lips twisted into a faint smirk, strong man like him. "He can take it." A good tool's meant to be used, not kept on a shelf. That afternoon, the pressure Croft spoke of found its victim. A young field hand, barely more than a boy, stumbled and dropped a bundle of cut sugarcane. It was a small mistake, born of exhaustion and blistering heat. But to Croft it was challenge to his authority. He dragged the boy to the open ground near the great oak, the place where punishments were delivered, where pain became spectacle. Tobias, having just finished sharpening the last of the hoes, was forced to watch. His knuckles whitened around his hammer handle as Croft's harsh voice broke the still air. Then came the whip. Its crack sliced through the silence, sharp and merciless. Once, twice, 3 times, the sound echoed like gunfire. The boy's cries were thin, desperate, and quickly swallowed by the indifferent sky. Tobias's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on scene. He watched every lash land, every shudder of agony that passed through the boy's frail body. When it was over, the boy's tear-streaked eyes met Tobias's for a fleeting instant. It was not a look of pity exchanged between them, but of shared pain, and something more, something awakening. That moment, brief as a spark, lit a cold, hard flame in Tobias's chest. A thought long buried in his heart began to take shape, quiet, dangerous, and resolute. That night, as dusk swallowed the plantation in shades of purple and gold, Tobias returned to his small cabin, The air inside was heavy with wood smoke and the scent of corn ash cake cooking over the hearth. His wife, Sarah, moved silently by the fire, her face a mixture of strength and worry. Their young son, Jacob, slept on a straw pallet in the corner, breathing the easy rhythm of innocence. Sarah turned as Tobias entered. Her eye immediately caught the dark bruise blooming on his arm. "Hard day?" she asked softly, touching the mark with gentle fingers. "The work is always hard," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He looked at her, then at their sleeping child. A long silence followed, a silence full of unspoken fear and fragile hope. They ate their meager meal in quiet companionship, weight of unvoiced thoughts between them. There was no mention of escape, no foolish dreams spoken aloud. Such words were too dangerous. Yet hope lingered in the room like a ghost. As the night deepened, Tobias whispered almost to himself, "A man must find his own shade." It was both a promise and a prophecy. When the plantation sank into the heavy silence of a moonless night, Tobias slipped quietly from his cabin, his bare feet soundless against the cool, damp earth. The world was asleep. The master's house loomed dark and silent, the overseer's cottage still, and even the night birds seemed to hold their breath. He moved through the shadows like one born of them, every sense sharpened by purpose. The path to the forge was familiar, worn by years of his own labor, but that night it felt different. It was no longer the walk of a slave toward toil. It was the march of a man toward destiny. Inside the forge, the air was thick with the scent of ash and iron. Tobias coaxed the embers back to life, the soft orange glow spilling over his face, casting his eyes in a determined, unwavering light. His hands, though scarred and rough, moved with precision born of long practice. But tonight, his work was not for Elias Vance or the overseer Croft. It was for himself. From a length of iron rod he had hidden weeks earlier, he began to forge a chain. The rhythmic clang of his hammer filled the night, each strike a heartbeat of rebellion. Sparks burst and died around him like fleeting stars, each one carrying the weight of unspoken defiance. He worked methodically, shaping each link with care, joining them with deliberate symmetry until the chain grew heavy and perfect under his hands. It was not a tool of bondage, but a statement, a message hammered in iron. Every clang spoke in a secret language that only the desperate and the brave could understand. When the first light of dawn crept into the sky, Tobias quenched the last glowing link in water, steam hissing like a whisper of finality. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles burned with exhaustion, but his purpose was complete. As morning broke, the plantation stirred. Roosters crowed, dogs barked, and the enslaved began to move toward their endless routines. It was then that the young field hand, the same boy who had felt Croft's whip just days before, heard something strange, a faint metallic clinking, a sound out of place amid the morning noises. Curious, he followed it toward the great oak, and when his eyes found its source, the bucket in his hands fell soundlessly to the ground. There, hanging from the lowest, thickest branch, the very one that had shaded Tobias day after day, was a heavy iron chain. Swaying gently in the early breeze, the tools and stool that always sat beneath the tree were gone. Only that chain remained, gleaming coldly in the sunlight. The boy froze, unable to speak, his heart pounding with a fear that felt too large for his small chest. Words spread not as a shout, but as a whisper, a slow, creeping murmur that moved through the quarters and fields like smoke. Work slowed, eyes lifted from the soil, and every face turned toward the oak. The clinking of the chain became the only sound that mattered, echoing like a question across the land. The mystery of it struck everyone dumb. How could it be? What had Tobias done, and where had he gone? As the sun climbed higher, the chain glittered fiercely, each link catching the light like a shard of truth too bright to look at. When Mr. Croft arrived, the calm broke like glass. He stormed toward the oak, his thick face twisting from confusion to fury. To him, the sight was not a wonder but an insult, a mockery of his power, a challenge to his control. The very instrument of punishment, the tool he used to bend others' will, now hung in defiance before all to see. "Get back to work," he roared, his voice ragged with rage. "Find him. I want him found by noon." He pointed to two men nearby, their faces pale and trembling. "Cut that down." But they hesitated, glancing between the overseer and the chain, as if touching it might bring ruin. Croft took a threatening step forward, his voice cracking like a whip. "Now!" One of the men boosted the other into the branches. With shaking hands, the man raised a hatchet and struck the chain. The metallic clang of each blow rang across the plantation, echoing into the still air until finally, with a heavy thud, the chain fell to the ground, coiling in the dust like a dead serpent. It lay there, lifeless, but its memory was already alive, etched into every mind that had seen it hanging. Croft's fury burned through him as he turned and stormed toward Tobias's cabin, his boots kicking up red dust with every step. He kicked open the fragile wooden door, splintering it against the wall. Inside, Sarah stood frozen, clutching her young son Jacob to her chest. Her eyes were wide, her fear palpable, yet her posture remained defiant. Croft's rage filled the tiny space like a storm. "Where is he?" he shouted, his voice shaking the air. "Where did he go? Did he talk of the North, who helped him?" Sarah said nothing for a long moment, her heart pounding so hard she thought Croft could hear it. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled but did not break. "He spoke of his work," she said clearly. "He spoke of his son." "That is all." Croft's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his shadow covering her face, searching for a lie in her gaze. He found nothing but terror, and beneath it, an unyielding strength he could not understand. With a snarl, he swept his arm across the mantel, sending their few small possessions crashing to the dirt floor. He stormed out, slamming the broken door behind him, leaving Sarah trembling in the wreckage, her son's muffled sobs filling the silence. Outside, the air buzzed with dread. The overseer's fury had become the plantation's storm, but beneath it, another feeling spread, quiet, hidden, unstoppable. Awe. Tobias Green had vanished, leaving behind not just chains, but a mystery that refused to die. The search that followed was a brutal performance rather than a true effort to find a missing man. Croft's fury turned the hunt into an act of domination, not investigation. He gathered a handful of white men from neighboring plantations, coarse, drunken men who shared his taste for cruelty, and together they rode out with dogs and rifles, shouting into the quiet woods as if their noise alone could summon Tobias back. The hounds barked and bayed, crashing through the cypress swamps and pine thickets, their masters trampling the soft earth, breaking branches, and scaring every living creature in sight. It was not a search born of reason but of rage, a desperate attempt to reassert control over a world that had suddenly defied it. Yet even as they tore through the wilderness, Tobias remained invisible. There was no broken branch, no footprint in the mud, no sign that a man had passed that way. It was as though the land itself had swallowed him whole. By late afternoon the men returned, their faces flushed with drink and frustration. Their horses lathered in sweat. They had found nothing, only silence, deep and endless, mocking their noise. That evening, when the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the fields turned to shadow, a small group gathered quietly behind the cabins. They sat in the soft dirt, the air heavy with questions. They dared not speak aloud. Old man Josiah, whose eyes held the weight of generations, sat on a stool, his hands folded over his knees. He had lived long enough to see the full circle of pain that passed through their people, the births and deaths, the punishments and prayers, the rare, fleeting moments of joy. Now he gazed toward the dark outline of the great oak, its branches stretching against the star-pocked sky, and his voice, when he finally spoke, rose low and steady, like a hymn carried on the wind. "That tree has seen 1,000 sorrows," he murmured, his eyes fixed on its vast shadow. "It has seen the whip, and it has seen the rope. Its roots drink the tears of our mothers and the blood of our fathers." The others leaned closer, the faint glow of a single lantern painting their faces in trembling light. Josiah's gaze stayed on the oak as he continued. Tobias knew that. He didn't just run from the chains. He turned them back on this place. He took the thing they used to bind us and hung it high for all to see. A murmur rippled through the listeners, a sound of quiet awe and understanding. Josiah's words gave form to the confusion and fear that had clouded their hearts all day. He left a warning, the old man said softly, his tone now a whisper of deep conviction, a warning that a man's spirit can't be chained, even if his body is. Silence followed, thick and reverent. The space beneath the oak no longer felt empty. It pulsed with something unseen, something alive. Tobias Green had vanished, but the void he left behind had already begun to fill, with meaning, with myth, with hope. Days turned into weeks, and the raw shock of his disappearance began to settle into legend. The story spread first in whispers through the quarters, then further, carried by travelers, field hands, and merchants. The official search, if Croft's drunken rampage could be called that, had long ended, but beyond the plantation boundaries the tale grew. In the nearby town, at the Saturday market where farmers and traders exchanged gossip over barrels of seed and tobacco, people spoke of the vanished blacksmith. "I heard Vance lost one of his smiths," said Jeb, a weathered farmer, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Ran off, I reckon. Costly man to lose. Good smiths ain't cheap." His companion, a younger man with wide, uneasy eyes, leaned in and lowered his voice. "It weren't just a runaway. My wife's cousin sews for Mrs. Vance, and she told her they found chains hanging from that big oak, empty chains, swinging in the wind, like some kind of curse." Jeb laughed, though uneasily. "Curse, fool talk. The man ran off and got eaten by gators, most likely." But the younger one shook his head. "She said the others won't go near that tree, not even in daylight. They say Tobias didn't run from his chains. He left them behind as a sign." And just like that, the story took root in two worlds at once. Among the white townsfolk, it became a tale of dark superstition, a ghost story whispered with nervous laughter. But among the enslaved, passed from one plantation to the next in low voices and coded hymns, it became something sacred, a story of defiance and deliverance. The legend grew in the telling. Around a moonlit river one evening after a secret baptism, a preacher from another plantation told it again, his voice thick with reverence. "They say the overseer tried to cut down the chains, but you can't cut down a sign from God," he said, and the people murmured, "Amen." Tobias was a man of iron and fire. He walked through the forge and was not burned. He took their chains, the very symbol of sorrow, and offered them up to heaven. The gathered souls nodded and wept softly, their faith rekindled by the story. The tree of pain had become a tree of promise. Tobias was no longer a man. They saw him as a sign, a spirit, a messenger that freedom was not only possible but destined. The story traveled faster than any horse, passed on the breath of those who dreamed of deliverance, and in that spreading legend Tobias Green, the vanished blacksmith, became something more enduring than any body could be. He became belief itself. In the grand dining room of the Vance house, the legend of Tobias Green became not a story of awe, but a source of irritation and embarrassment. Elias Vance sat at the head of his long, gleaming table, the silverware clinking against china in sharp, hollow tones that mirrored his mood. His wife, pale and nervous, toyed with her food without appetite. "The servants are restless, Elias," she said in a thin voice. "They whisper to each other. There's a feeling in the air. It's unsettling." Vance slammed his fork down, the sound making her flinch. "Unsettling?" he barked. "It's a financial loss, that's what it is. A valuable hand has vanished. And now my entire operation is crippled by this nonsense about ghosts and curses." His face was flushed with irritation, not grief or guilt, only wounded pride. "I was at the market today," he continued, "and men spoke not of the loss of a slave, but of hauntings. They make my plantation seem unstable. It reflects poorly on me." Across the room stood Mr. Croft, arms folded, his jaw clenched. Vance turned his gaze to him sharply. "I want this foolishness ended, Croft. I don't care how you do it. Anyone caught spreading tales, punish them. I want the name Tobias forgotten by week's end." Croft nodded stiffly, though inside him humiliation seethed. His authority, already shaken by Tobias's disappearance, now trembled under the master's command. He had ruled through fear, but fear was now working against him. The people no longer feared him as much as they believed in the ghost of the man he had failed to break. That invisible defiance was more powerful than his whip. Still, Croft set about his task with a grim, brutal precision. He stalked the quarters, splitting up conversations, silencing songs that carried hidden meanings. Any two people whispering were separated. Anyone caught humming a hymn of freedom was given double work. A young woman caught telling a child the story of the chains was tied to a post and threatened with the lash, though Croft hesitated to strike. He feared the act itself might fuel very myth he wanted to bury, but nothing worked. The story lived on, carried in the glances exchanged between workers, in the rhythm of their shovels and the secret verses of their songs. The legend had become part of them. Croft's frustration grew until it twisted into paranoia. He began to see Tobias's shadow everywhere, and the rustling of the leaves in the ring of the hammer from the new blacksmith who had taken his place. He heard the whisper of the man's name in every gust of wind that passed through the oak. Sleep came less and less. He drank more, snapping at even the smallest mistakes, his authority hollowing into madness. The oak tree itself had become his enemy, a towering reminder of the one soul who had defied him and won. While Croft's cruelty unraveled, Sarah lived in quiet sorrow. Her days followed the same rhythm, washing, mending, cooking, her body obedient, her spirit elsewhere. Every movement was haunted by the memory of her husband, by the sound of his hammer and the warmth of his quiet presence. At times her eyes would drift toward the great oak, her heart tightening with unspoken prayers. The story told by others, of Tobias as a ghost, a saint, symbol, was too large for her to hold. She needed something small, something human. One afternoon, as she swept the hard, packed earth outside her cabin, her eyes caught a small glint at the base of the oak. She bent down and brushed away the dirt, revealing a smooth gray stone no bigger than her thumb, marked by a perfect white ring circling its center. Her breath caught. She knew this stone. Tobias had once kept a small cloth pouch hidden in the wall of their cabin, filled with curious little treasures, shiny stones, bits of colored glass, odd pieces of metal, things he called earth gifts. He would show them to Jacob sometimes, telling him that even in the hardest ground, beauty could still be found if you looked close enough. The sight of the ringed stone now brought tears to her eyes. It was impossible to say whether it had truly been left for her, a message planted in that final night, or whether chance had rolled it there. Yet in her heart it didn't matter. She clutched it in her hand, feeling its cool, solid weight, and for the first time since his disappearance she felt something that was not despair, hope. She slipped the stone into her pocket, its presence a secret against her leg, a hidden pulse of comfort she carried everywhere. It became her private proof that Tobias was still alive somewhere, that he remembered her, that he had found his shade and was waiting for her to find hers. But outside that fragile sanctuary of faith, the world remained cruel. Croft's temper darkened, his punishments harsher, his control slipping further with each passing day. The atmosphere on the plantation thickened with fear, not of punishment this time, but of a man unraveling. The slaves had once trembled at his wrath, now they pitied him. He was haunted by something beyond his reach, a man who had escaped not just his grasp, but the world itself. As autumn came and the air cooled, the plantation continued to move in its slow, weary rhythm, but the legend of Tobias Green did not fade. It lingered like smoke after a fire, unseen yet always there, filling every breath with the memory of the man who had left his chains behind. As the seasons shifted, and the relentless Georgia sun softened into the warm gold of autumn, a new sound joined the weary rhythm of the plantation, the rattle of a merchant's wagon rolling down the dirt road. The man's name was Silas, a traveling trader whose visits came every few months, bringing bolts of cloth, coffee, trinkets, and the precious currency of gossip. He was talkative by nature, the kind of man who filled the long silences of the road with stories he had gathered like coins from every town he passed. On that afternoon he sat on the veranda of the Vance house with Elias Vance himself, sharing whiskey and conversation. A house servant refilled their glasses silently, her face a mask of obedience though her ears were tuned to every word. "Lost a prime hand, you say?" Silas asked, swirling his drink. "A blacksmith, wasn't he?" Vance's jaw tightened. "A valuable one," he said flatly. "Vanished without a trace. Left me in a bind before harvest." Silas leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Well now, that's a curious thing. I was up in the Piedmont of South Carolina not 3 weeks ago, and word there was of a runaway. Big man, sharp eyes, blacksmith by trade, traveling with a white man. Said he was a Quaker, an abolitionist named Seth Macy. Vance's attention sharpened instantly, his eyes narrowing. And, did they catch him? Silas smiled faintly, savoring the drama of his own tale. Not for lack of trying. Sheriff raised a posse, but the two of them disappeared, gone like smoke. People say they were heading north, quiet and fast, maybe following the underground routes. The locals never saw them again. Behind them, the servant's hand trembled as she poured more whiskey. Her expression did not change, but her heart thundered in her chest. She carried that secret like a spark, careful not to let it show as she retreated into the house. By dusk, the whisper had already taken root among the enslaved. It passed from the servant to the cook, from the cook to her son in the stables, and from him to a field hand drawing water. It moved like current through wire, a silent chain of hope no overseer could see. By nightfall, the message reached Sarah. She was mending Jacob's torn shirt when a woman walking home from the fields stopped outside her cabin, pretending to adjust her shoe. In a low voice, she murmured, "They say a blacksmith was seen north, with a Quaker, heading toward the star." Then she walked on, leaving the words glowing in the dark like embers. Sarah froze, her breath catching. The words struck her like lightning. Tobias free. She whispered the name in her mind, afraid to let it pass her lips. A dizzy rush of joy flooded her, so fierce she almost dropped her sewing. She pictured him on some quiet road beneath strange stars, walking beside that pale stranger toward freedom. But as quickly as the hope came, fear followed. Hope, for Sarah, had always carried a shadow. If Tobias was alive and running north, then he was being hunted. Her joy turned sharp, her heart pounding with dread. She could see him in her mind, cornered, beaten, dragged back in chains heavier than before. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket for the small gray stone with the white ring, clutching it tight until its edge bit her palm. It was no longer just a keepsake. It was a prayer, a shield against the images clawing at her mind. The rumor that gave Sarah both hope and terror reached Elias Vance the next morning through Croft. When the overseer repeated the merchant's words, Vance's irritation curdled into pure fury. Tobias's escape had already insulted his pride. The thought that it had been aided by an organized network of abolitionists turned the wound into open humiliation. It meant this was no act of desperation but rebellion, a defiance planned and executed beneath his nose. It meant Tobias Green might become a symbol. And symbols, Vance knew, were dangerous. "If he's alive," he said, his voice cold and precise, "then I want him found. I'll pay whatever it takes." That night, he sent a rider north carrying a pouch of coins and a letter addressed to a name spoken in whispers across the South. The name Finch. Finch was a man known not for noise or cruelty, but for results. His reputation traveled farther than any bounty notice. He was the hunter of ghosts, the one who always found those who vanished, and now he was coming for Tobias Green. A week later, he arrived at dusk, a tall, lean figure on a wiry horse, his face drawn in sharp, hard lines. He rode in without a word, the faint creak of his saddle the only sound. 2 dogs trotted silently beside him, dark, coated, lean, and intelligent. There was no bluster in him, no swagger like Croft's, only a calm, patient menace that chilled the air. When the enslaved first saw him, conversations stopped. Mothers pulled children indoors. Even the dogs in the quarters went quiet. The name Finch had reached them long before the man did. He was said to follow trails no one else could see, to find men buried in the very woods that hid them. His arrival meant one thing: the hunt had begun again. Finch's arrival brought with it a silence thicker than the fog that clung to Georgia fields. He was not a man who wasted words or motion. His every step, every glance felt measured, deliberate, as if he were dissecting the very air around him for clues. He began not with threats or orders, but with quiet observation. In the forge where Tobias had once worked, Finch stood for hours, his long fingers tracing the worn edges of the anvil, the grooves in the workbench, the scattered tools left behind. Each mark, each burn, each fleck of metal seemed to tell him something. To him, The forge was not merely a place of labor, it was a mind laid bare. He examined the space as if reading a message written in the language of steel and sweat. From there he moved to the cabin, stepping through the small doorway as though entering a tomb. His cold eyes took in every corner, the neatly mended wall, the rough cot, the simple possessions that still carried the ghost of a man's presence. He crouched once to tap a floorboard, listening for hollowness. Then he straightened and stood in silence for a long moment before turning to Sarah, who stood by the hearth, her back straight though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. He did not bark or threaten as Croft had. His voice was low, almost calm. "I need to ask you questions about your husband," he said, the tone not suggesting a choice. Sarah nodded faintly, her throat too dry to speak. Finch did not sit. He paced slowly, his boots scuffing the dirt floor in a steady rhythm, circling her like a predator testing its prey. "Your husband was a good blacksmith," he said, his eyes sharp and searching. "A man who understands patience and precision. He wouldn't have run blindly, he would have planned. Who helped him?" Sarah swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay even. "He kept to himself mostly. His work and his family, that was his life." Finch stopped pacing, his hand reaching toward a small wooden carving that lay half buried in the dust. A bird Tobias had once whittled for Jacob. Finch turned it over in his palm, his expression unreadable. "He made this," he said quietly. "Fine work. A man who can carve something this delicate doesn't act on impulse. He plans, he calculates." His eyes lifted, pinning her where she stood. "And I always find the trail." Sarah met his gaze, feeling the room shrink around her. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might betray her, but she held firm. "He is my husband," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I pray he is safe, but I do not know where he has gone." Finch studied her for a long, terrible moment. His face gave nothing away, but something in his gaze flickered. Perhaps recognition, perhaps respect. Then he set the bird gently back on the mantel and turned toward the door. "If he's alive," he said quietly, "he won't be for long." And then he was gone, his silent dogs following him into the dusk. Sarah stood frozen long after the sound of his boots faded, her body trembling not from fear of the man, but from the renewed terror his words brought. That night, quarters were restless. No one slept easily. The name Finch passed from mouth to mouth like a curse. Mothers hushed their children, and men stared into the darkness beyond their doors, wondering if Tobias was still out there somewhere, or already gone. But in the midst of that fear, something else began to take shape, something Josiah, the old preacher, would soon give voice to. Later that night, under a thin crescent moon, a small group gathered once more behind Josiah's cabin. The old man sat with his back against the wall, his eyes reflecting the faint firelight. The people looked to him the way they always did when the world became too heavy to carry alone. "The hunter is here," whispered one man. "Finch finds everyone." Josiah lifted his gaze skyward, where the stars burned cold and bright. "There are trails on the earth," he said softly, "and there are trails in the heavens. Finch follows the ones in dust, but he cannot see the path of light." His hand rose, pointing toward the North Star, a steady beacon above the trembling crowd. "That star is the drinking gourd," he said. "The old ones taught us long ago. It leads to the river of moonlight that flows north. They say there's a railroad that runs underground, built not by iron, but by faith. Finch can chase a man's shadow across the earth, but he cannot catch the soul that walks that road." Murmurs of hope rippled through the gathered faces. Josiah's words wrapped around them like a blanket against the cold. "We must not fear the hunter," he continued. "We must pray Tobias found his station on that holy railroad. Pray he rides the light all the way to freedom." His deep, trembling voice turned fear into faith, turning Tobias's flight into a sacred journey rather than an act of escape. In that moment, the story changed again. It was no longer about a man running from bondage. It became a pilgrimage guided by God and stars, beyond the reach of earthly chains. The people who listened felt their fear lessen, replaced by a quiet, burning strength. They believed Tobias had found the path no hound could scent, no overseer could follow. He had stepped onto the river of moonlight that led beyond the grasp of this world, and for the first time in many weeks they smiled through their tears, whispering a prayer not for his capture, but for his deliverance. Croft's fall was not sudden. It came like rot through timber, slow and silent at first, then complete. In the weeks after Finch's failure, his authority dissolved like smoke. The men and women who once flinched at the crack of his voice now moved around him as if he were already a ghost. He would stride through the quarters at night, lantern in one hand, whip in the other, muttering to himself. Sometimes he would stop beneath the oak tree, staring up at its dark branches, his lips moving soundlessly as though arguing with something unseen. His eyes had grown hollow, the whites tinged yellow from drink, and his face was a map of sleepless nights. More than once, workers heard him shouting Tobias's name into the darkness, the sound echoing across the fields like a man calling to his own guilt. The oak had become his tormentor. Every creak of its branches, every whisper of the wind through its leaves, sounded to him like chains rattling. He tried to avoid it, but the tree seemed to meet his gaze from every corner of the land. It haunted him, just as he had once haunted others. One night, in a drunken rage, he ordered 2 field hands to chop it down, cut it to the roots. He screamed, "Burn it to ash." But the men hesitated, their faces pale with fear. "Please, sir," one stammered, "that tree's been here longer than any of us." "Ain't right to." The whip lashed across his back before he could finish. Yet even as Croft's rage flared, the tree stood untouched. The men refused to approach it, claiming their axes turned heavy in their hands, their blades dulled against its bark. Croft cursed them all and stormed off, the bottle in his hand sloshing. He never tried again. The next morning, his body was found at the base of that same oak. No one knew what happened. Some said he slipped and broke his neck. Others whispered the tree had taken its vengeance. His lantern lay shattered beside him, the glass glittering like stars in the dirt. The only sound was the faint clink of a loose chain stirring in the breeze. When Vance heard the news, he showed no sorrow, only irritation at the inconvenience. Croft's death was reported as an accident, his name barely mentioned after that. But among the enslaved, the story spread like fire. Tobias had returned, they said, his spirit walking the land to deliver justice. The oak became holy ground. No one worked near it. No one dared cut its branches. At night, some came quietly to pray beneath it, leaving offerings of corn, feathers, or small stones at its roots. Sarah went there too, one night when the moon was high and her son slept. She carried the gray stone in her hand, its smooth surface warmed by her touch. Standing beneath the tree, she felt the air hum softly, as if alive. She knelt, placed the stone at the base, and whispered, "You are free now." "So am I." Then she rose and walked back to her cabin without looking behind her. Time began to pass differently after that. The years that followed were marked by small changes that at first seemed meaningless. An overseer less cruel than the last, a field hand allowed a day's rest after a child's birth, a rumor that Vance was planning to sell the land. But beneath those surface ripples, something deeper was shifting. The people carried Tobias's name like a seed inside them, passing it quietly to their children, their children's children. Jacob, Sarah's son, grew into a strong young man, tall like his father, with the same steady eyes. He became known for fixing tools, mending iron, shaping metal with a patient hand. Each strike of his hammer was a whisper of the past, a rhythm that echoed his father's forge. When he worked, others would pause to listen, hearing in the ringing of steel the same defiant heartbeat that once filled the night long ago. By the time Elias Vance's health began to fail, the plantation was a ghost of its former self. The fields grew wild at the edges, fences sagged, and the main house stood half empty, its white paint peeling beneath years of neglect. The new overseer, a mild man by comparison, did his best to maintain order but lacked the cruelty that had once ruled the place. Vance's wealth slipped away quietly, sold piece by piece to pay debts. When he died, few mourned him. His name faded, but Tobias's remained. The legend of vanished blacksmith outlived them all. Travelers spoke of it in towns miles away, of the man who forged his own freedom in fire, who hung his chains from a tree, and whose spirit came back to reclaim justice. To some, it was a ghost story told around fires. To others, it was scripture, proof that the soul of a man could not be broken by iron or fear. In northern towns, where abolitionist meetings grew in number, the name Tobias Green appeared in sermons and pamphlets. He who cast down his chains, one preacher wrote, showed us the shape of freedom itself. No one knew for certain whether Tobias lived in some quiet village under a new name or died along the road, but that uncertainty only fed the legend. In the South, people said his spirit still watched over those who worked in the fields, guiding their hands when they forged tools, whispering courage when they faced the whip. In the North, they said he crossed the river of stars and built a forge of his own, hammering light into the chains of others until they broke free. For Sarah and Jacob, life went on with quiet dignity. When freedom finally came, years later, with the sound of distant drums and the rumor of soldiers, it blew. The mother and son walked beyond the plantation's edge without looking back. At the crossroads, Sarah paused only once to glance toward the great oak. The wind stirred its branches gently, and she thought she heard a faint metallic clink, as though the past itself were saying farewell. Then she turned toward the road ahead, her hand resting lightly on Jacob's shoulder, and together they walked toward a future Tobias had forged long before with fire, courage, and the will to be free. Years after the war ended and the smoke of battle cleared from the American South, the land that had once echoed with the sound of chains began to hum with a different rhythm. The rhythm of rebuilding, of uncertain freedom, of people learning to walk upright for the first time in generations. The old plantations lay in ruin, their fields overgrown, their once grand houses hollow with decay. Nature was reclaiming what greed had taken. Among those ruins, stories survived longer than walls, carried on the breath of the freed, and none lived stronger than that of Tobias Green. His name had become a beacon, a whispered promise passed from mouth to mouth across the broken South. Freedmen spoke of him around their campfires, in the shanty towns rising from the ashes, in the churches where they gathered to sing the same hymns they once sang in chains. He hung his chains on a tree, they would say, their voices trembling with pride. He showed us we could do the same. In one settlement near Savannah, an old preacher named Josiah, his hair white as cotton now, stood before a congregation of men and women who had once been property and now were people. The church was nothing more than a wooden frame with a roof of patched tin, but inside it was full of light and song. Brothers and sisters, Josiah thundered, his voice still strong, the Lord sends us signs in every age. Once he sent Moses to lead his people through the water. Then he sent Tobias Green to show us how to walk through fire. The people rose in chorus, clapping their hands, shouting amen, until their voices shook the rafters. For them, Tobias was no longer a man. They spoke his name as they would a saint's. His act of rebellion had turned into a sacred story of deliverance, a testament to courage that defied death itself. Far to the north, in towns that had once been stops on Underground Railroad, his legend took on a different shape. Abolitionists and freed families told their children of the blacksmith who forged freedom in iron and faith. In one small Pennsylvania village, a young boy asked his father if Tobias Green was real. The man smiled and said, "Real enough that you're standing here today." His son, inspired, grew to be a teacher, and in his classroom he kept a small iron chain nailed to the wall, not as a reminder of bondage, but of what it meant to break it. Generations grew up hearing the tale until the line between history and faith blurred. Some said Tobias had indeed crossed the river into free country and lived out his days under a new name, building tools and teaching other runaways to work iron. Others swore he was killed on the road, and it was his spirit that crossed over, walking north under the stars. Both stories carried the same truth, that a man's body could vanish, but his courage could not. Meanwhile, the land Tobias left behind bore strange signs of its own. Travelers passing near the old Vance plantation spoke of a great oak standing alone in a field, its bark dark and knotted, its branches vast as a cathedral. They said the air around it felt different, cooler, calmer, as if holding its own memory. Some swore they could still see a faint glimmer of iron deep in its roots, where the earth had swallowed the chain long ago. A few even claimed that, on quiet nights, a sound would drift through the field, a faint, metallic chime, like a hammer striking an anvil in the distance. Those who believed said it was Tobias, still working, forging something unseen. By then, the plantation had new owners, but none stayed long. The crops failed, the wells dried, and the locals said the land would never yield for those who worked it with greed. They avoided the oak, calling it the freedom tree. To the freed families who settled nearby, it became sacred ground. They gathered beneath its shade each year on the anniversary of emancipation, singing songs that had once been forbidden. Children would play at its base, and elders would tell the story of the man who hung his chains from its branches and vanished into legend. He walked north, they'd say, pointing toward the horizon. Follow the star, and you'll find where he went. The story spread beyond Georgia, carried by migrants moving west in search of new beginnings. Blacksmiths in small towns began to hang a single iron link above their forges, calling it Tobias's mark. Freedmen working the rails kept small iron charms in their pockets, believing they brought protection on the road. His name became a quiet emblem of endurance, passed from one generation to the next like a hidden prayer. Even among those who never heard his full story, something of his spirit lingered. In the songs sung in fields, in the rhythm of hammers striking metal, in the way people lifted their eyes toward the North Star with a kind of reverence, Tobias lived on. Years turned to decades, and the world changed around his legend. Machines replaced whips, and factories replaced plantations, but the hunger for freedom, the fire he had kindled, never dimmed. In time, historians would argue about whether Tobias Green had truly existed, whether his story was fact or folklore, but for the descendants of those who had once been enslaved, it did not matter. His truth was written not in paper or ink, but in memory, and the resilience of those who survived. To them, Tobias was real in the only way that mattered. He was proof that a single act of defiance could outlive the man who made it. Years turned into generations, and the world Tobias Green had known faded into dust and history books, yet his story refused to die. It moved through time like a living current, invisible but unbroken, shaping hearts long after the hands that forged it had turned to ash. By the dawn of the new century, the country was changing again, cities rising, railroads spreading like veins, and people from every walk of life searching for meaning in the noise of progress. In that restless age, the story of Tobias found new life, passed not only by word of mouth, but in songs, sermons, and pages of literature that carried his name like a flame. Writers spoke of him as the smith of freedom. Artists painted him in murals as a shadowed figure standing beneath a vast tree, chains glinting in the wind. For those who saw the painting, it was more than art. It was testimony. Churches in the South told his story as parable. Schools in the North taught his name beside Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, the ones who had made the impossible real. Even when scholars debated whether Tobias had truly lived, those who believed in him simply smiled. Truth, they said, was larger than proof. In one small Georgia town, built not far from the ruins of the old Vance plantation, the descendants of the freed gathered to build a chapel beneath the oak that still stood strong after 100 years. Its roots had grown deep into the soil that once drank sorrow, its branches wide enough to shelter generations. When the workers cleared the earth around its base, they uncovered something cold and glinting, a fragment of iron, curved and blackened with age. They lifted it carefully, recognizing it for what it was, a piece of the chain Tobias had hung so long ago. They cleaned it, polished it, and placed it above the chapel's doorway, where the sunlight could touch it each morning. The Freedom Tree, as it had come to be known, became a place of pilgrimage. Families traveled from across the state to stand beneath its shade, to lay hands on its bark, to whisper prayers of gratitude. On Emancipation Day, the people gathered there each year, farmers, teachers, elders, children, all singing the same song, its melody soft but unyielding, steal away to freedom. And when the wind passed through the oak's branches, it seemed to hum along, faint metallic chime of its buried roots joining in harmony. In those moments, the boundary between past and present blurred. They said that if you listened closely, you could hear the echo of a hammer striking an anvil somewhere deep in the earth, as if Tobias were still at work, shaping freedom. Link by link, his spirit had become part of the land itself. Even those who had never heard his full story felt him in their bones when they stood beneath the tree's shade. The quiet defiance in the air, the steady pulse of resilience that would not fade. For Sarah and Jacob's descendants, his name became both inheritance and promise. They spoke of him not as myth, but as kin. They told their children that courage was forged, not given, that freedom must be shaped by one's own hands. And when life pressed hard, when injustice rose again, as it always seemed to, they remembered Tobias, the man who chose to turn his chains into a message instead of a weapon, and they drew strength from him. Decades passed, and the world continued to change. Wars were fought, rights were won and lost and won again, but the legend remained steady, like the star Tobias once followed. Writers of a new generation rediscovered his tale, weaving it into novels and songs, sometimes changing the details, sometimes romanticizing them, but always returning to the same truth, that a single act of faith and defiance could ripple through centuries. In time, a small museum was built beside the chapel, displaying the old iron link, a few rusted tools, and a plaque that read simply, "Tobias Green, the man who forged freedom." Visitors came from distant cities to stand before it in silence, not for the relic itself, but for what it meant. They would walk from the museum to the tree, lay a hand upon its bark, and feel the heartbeat of something that refused to die. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the fields glowed with golden light, the children of that town would play near the oak, their laughter echoing through the same air that once carried the sound of chains. And sometimes, just as dusk settled, a faint wind would move through the branches, making the leaves whisper. The old folks would smile then and say, "That's Tobias walking home." It was not superstition or sadness, it was remembrance. The world had changed, but the soul of his story endured. That freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the courage to break them. And so, long after names like Vance and Croft were lost to time, Tobias Green lived on. In the songs of the people, in the swing of a hammer, in the strength of a mother's hand guiding her child toward the light. The forge fire that once burned in the heart of a single man now burned in them all, eternal and unbound.